Welcome everyone to this pretty Dutch party. We're still going to do it in English though. And we're starting right on time at 4 o'clock, and we're going to run until 5 with some questions during the chat and also at the end. So if you do have a burning question, raise your hand, or I'll signal that there are some moments where it makes most sense for you to walk to the mic that's been set up in the middle of the room for your questions. Welcome again, and welcome to you all here on the very chic stage and the cushy couches. We're here to talk about the interaction between all of your work. So government, DPA, civil society, and we're interested in not so much as we often do, focusing on what's not going well enough and what needs to be improved, but looking at what things have gone particularly well, and especially in kind of the dynamic between these different stakeholders and what we can learn from that going forward. Before we dive into that, I want to introduce everyone here briefly. So Cecile, I will start with you. So here directly to my left is Cecile Schut. She's the Director of Systems Oversight, Security and Technology for the Dutch DPA. You've been in that role since 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So that's enough time to have some idea about the successes that we want to be speaking about here today. Before that, you worked for Statistics Netherlands, where when you left, you were managing the policy staff, which might give people the impression that you have a legal background. You don't. You're an engineer by training. Sjoera is sitting next to you. Sjoera is a consultant at the Dutch company, privacy company, and a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, among others, I'm sure. A very interesting background. Previously, you worked for the Dutch DPA, and you were also involved in founding Bits of Freedom, the organization I now work for, and European Digital Rights, that also this year celebrated its 20th anniversary. So you've been around for a long time, and you've seen the topics we're speaking about today from many different angles. So thank you for being here. Estelle is sitting over there in the blue. You're Europe's, or Access now is Europe legislative manager and global data protection lead for almost. You've been with Access now for almost 10 years, which I think is really exciting. It's nice to see people hang around civil society for a good while. You're also a member of the European Commission's multi-stakeholder expert group to support the application of the GDPR, and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Data Protection, among others. So welcome, and thank you for sharing the burden of, sharing the burden of being the only non-Dutch person, and also representing Europe on this panel. I'm sure you'll do well in those tasks. And then finally, Roozendaal, you're the Director of Digital Society for the Ministry of the Interior for a few weeks now, I think. It's a year already. Yeah. Okay, a fairly new role. Also the Deputy Director General of Digitization and Government Organization, also at the Ministry of the Interior. And prior to this, you worked for, if I'm not mistaken, 12 years at the Ministry of Health. In a lot of different roles, famous in the Netherlands for developing for leading the development of the COVID apps in 2020, 2021. And before that, and this work probably was equally, if not more important, but got you a lot less media attention, your work on the information policy and the Dutch Healthcare Information Council, among others. Any grave errors that need correcting? Okay, good. So thank you all again for agreeing to contribute and to participate in this little, I don't know if it's an experiment, but it feels like a different conversation than the ones we're used to having. And we're doing it in public. So I don't know if that's a good idea, but we'll find out afterwards. As I said, we want to reflect on how your work interacts and what we can learn about that for the future. We're departing from a few assumptions. Those assumptions are that your work is deeply connected, that you have a common goal, which is protecting people's fundamental right to privacy, and that at the moment we aren't realizing the full potential of the GDPR. So before we go into the examples that you've brought with you, I just wondered if either of you would like to give a short reflection on those assumptions. Estelle, I don't know if maybe I can start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Also want to clarify that somehow the panel says that I'm Belgium, but I'm French, so breaking a little bit the Flemish Dutch tendency in this of this panel. Sorry. The assumption that you presented, the 3 layers of assumption, I think I would agree that this is one that I witness at the European level, so not speaking necessarily about how the Dutch government and the interaction between Dutch NGOs and Dutch regulators, but this is fairly an assumption that, having been in Brussels for a while, we could see translate in the way legislation was being advanced and the way also the digital market, speaking about technology specifically, originally was thought through. A lot because we started with data protection that has a legal basis linked to fundamental right. But where I see a shift in this assumption is about the common goal of protecting privacy. And it's not to say that there is a movement away from it, but now, once the GDPR had been created, we have seen a movement from the European Union mandate move from fundamental right approach and privacy focus approach to a market approach. There is many reasons for that, and there is I'm sure we'll discuss these, but I do think that it's important to put back the assumption that you've just mentioned that should be indeed underlying the goals that we shared, because it's no longer not only not felt necessarily on the way legislation is being implemented or being enforced, but it's also clearly no longer developed that way. And oftentimes concepts like innovation and market are taking over fundamental right or are being put as if they're an equal that needs to be balancing with. And so that's not to say that there is no, obviously, importance to think about economic development, and this also help having human rights realized. But human rights are fundamental value that shouldn't be compromised and cannot be compromised. And so if we start from a get-go of there will be a trade-off and we need to have this trade-off, this is a huge departing from saying that we want to have a society and an online society that is based on value and on rights. And so we're seeing this shift slowly but surely advancing up to the point where the latest big legislation being discussed here, the AI Act, is really the symbol of it, as it was introduced as a risk-based legislation instead of a rights-based legislation. And if you have a market approach, that's fine to think about risk. What is the risk for the market? But if you think about the impact that AI technologies will have and have already on human rights, letting private actors decide how much risks they can take with your fundamental right is extremely problematic. So the assumptions are correct, but we're slowly departing from it.
Sjoera, is that something that you see as well?
I completely agree, of course, with Estelle that one of the most special things about the GDPR is that it's founded on the human rights pillar, right, in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, as opposed to 100% market-based legislation. In my daily life, I carry out risk assessments, so I am employed by the risk approach. I carry out data protection impact assessments for the Dutch government and for the coalition of universities and schools in the Netherlands. And I do think it's super helpful to at least, once you've performed that risk assessment and you signal high risk, that's the start of a conversation with, in my case, big tech companies like Microsoft and Google and Zoom and AWS, etc. And then you can use this risk-based approach to create fundamental improvements, basically. If you take the most principled approach, I think if you follow Estelle, we're too late already because the services are already being used and they are deployed. And then you would basically have to give up and say, okay, you know, it's done. What else is left to do? So I think just tweaking it and sometimes gentle and sometimes with force. And that's where I need the help of Cecile. That's where, because all my work is based on, you know, the GDPR possibility to carry out a data protection impact assessment, but I don't have any powers to finally force these companies to mitigate high risk, and that's where Cecile comes in.
So maybe these things can also or have to exist side by side. When we're forming new legislation, we need to focus on the fundamental rights. Once that legislation is here, a risk-based approach can actually help to bring fundamental changes. Yeah. I would like to stay with you, or stick with you for now, and we asked each of the panelists to prepare an example that shows just how interconnected your work is, and in some ways how reliant you are on each other. And you have a great example involving the Dutch government and Microsoft. Would you be willing to share that?
Of course. So I worked for the Dutch Data Protection Authority, and I carried out an investigation on Windows 10 on telemetry data. And I left the Dutch DPA, and the Dutch government basically called me and said, can you repeat that same kind of research on Microsoft Office? Because we were really surprised, these telemetry data, nobody knew about it. And I wrote this report for a group of people within the Ministry of Justice that are the central procurement office for the entire Dutch government, which is kind of special in itself, that the Dutch government has organized its buying power to create leverage when talking to big tech companies to say, okay, but we're buying on behalf of 300,000 Dutch government officials and probably even more in the municipalities, in the provinces, and everybody that will follow our lead. And they asked me to inspect, and we found, well, 10 times the amount of telemetry in Office that we found in Windows. And they had the guts to actually publish that report, which is quite special for government, considering that all these 300,000 government officials were already using Microsoft Office. And well, from a risk-based perspective, it's not very comfortable for government to publish a report saying, okay, we're basically violating the law, and hope that we don't get an intervention from the Dutch Data Protection Authority, because how are we possibly going to do our work without Microsoft Office? But they did, and it was published in English, and because it was in English, actually the journalists on the West and East Coast actually picked it up, which meant articles in morning newsletters from, for example, Politico, and that reaches what US Americans tend to call the C-suite, the people that manage these big tech companies that have a C in their title. And that resulted in a complete turnabout and a willingness, in this case from Microsoft, to make really fundamental changes in the product for the enterprise and the education customers, not per se for the consumers, because we were not negotiating for the consumers, but they because all the time when we were negotiating, Microsoft told us, we can't change anything for you. You're the Netherlands, right? And we're a huge ocean cruiser. We can't just change course because you're asking. But once we convinced them that they had to change course to be able to operate in a legal way in Europe, in a way that's compliant with the GDPR, they did change course, and then they made these global improvements in their services. And I think that was a great example how government used its buying power, its leverage, but also by publishing it. And, you know, that's the best way to gain a lot of attention, even when there's risks. And I can tell you now, we were quite afraid that we were going to get an intervention from the Dutch DPA.
To stick with that last point a little bit, Ron, I don't know if you could maybe speak a little to Sjoera's comment about how it's not that common that the government would publish something like that, and kind of the process that you would have to go through to say, okay, we're going to do it.
Well, to have society trust government, you need to be transparent. And to be transparent, you need to be open in what you find in doing these exercises. And we did so for more than just Microsoft. And we did, and Sjoera did that too, a human rights impact assessment on the use of Facebook pages by the Dutch government, which it transcends from just looking into privacy to looking into human rights. And I'm very proud we did that. And that one is published also. And that's about, well, if people visit a government page on vaccines, for example, what type of ads do they get? And they don't get real scientific ads next to the government page, for example. So we're now looking into the human rights aspects of government use of these type of systems. And I think Sjoera will be able to tell about that too.
Just staying with you a little bit longer,
okay.
Sorry.
Just try.
So just to go back to this situation where so government realizes we're making use of a service in a way that's probably not GDPR compliant. We're heavily reliant on it. If we publish this report, the DPA will become very aware of it. But we're going to do it anyway. So what goes through your mind when making a decision like that?
Well, actually, we need the DPA to be aware of it. Because to have those systems change, they have to be aware that the DPA is watching them. So we need the DPA to be aware of it.
So was that a strategic decision then?
No, it's a fundamental discussion. It's about being transparent and being open.
Okay, thank you. Cecile, these people here were terrified of what your reaction was going to be.
Yeah, I'm very glad with that, of course. But anyway, let me say a few things about this, because I think it's a very interesting way to try to get things GDPR-proof. But let me say another thing first, that of course it would be even better if government or whoever is processing personal data is thinking about using whatever services or software on beforehand and trying to get a GDPR proof on right away, and tries to develop things privacy-proof, etc. And I think that's very important, and that's what we're aiming for. So, having said this, when Dutch government was publishing the data protection impact assessment on Microsoft, we got it, and we treated it as it was a prior consultation for us. And then we made a report with our advice on it, which could be used by Dutch government to go to Microsoft so that they... sorry, it was the other case. But anyway, I think in this way, you can see that we can really enforce each other on this kind of topics. And we get even other prior consultations, not as much as we expected, but we get them sometimes from parties who are really thinking about using a service or trying to convince a processor or somebody who is going to work for them to be GDPR compliant. And then we can really be of help to assess whether they did their data protection impact assessment well and whether we have advice. And I think so the interplay between organizations who have their own responsibility, which is laid down in the GDPR, to think themselves, to really be aware of what they have to do, the interplay from them with us, I think that really can be a very strong way to work. And I hope that we can develop these kind of things in future.
Thank you. Estelle, coming to you, so I'm curious if when you were in the run-up to the GDPR, when you were working on it, if this is how you envisioned enforcement to look like, and also is this kind of a dynamic that you've encountered more often, maybe also outside of the Netherlands?
I think the enforcement of the GDPR was a big question mark for many of us here, because also of the structure of the enforcement, the so-called one-stop shop, and we knew it was going to be a new system being created, and so it's been a learning experience for everyone. And our expectation, at least on the civil society side, would have been for a faster enforcement, in particular for issues that already were problematic under the previous legislation, the directive from 1995, that felt that we needed to move ahead from this question and not be stuck on how is content valid and can I have a tick box, and to be able to enter into deep conversation of business model, frankly, of use of data. We're not there yet, but we're hopeful that we will. And it's also, I think, it's been a learning curve from even the data protection authorities themselves to learn how to work with this new system. So it's still it's going to be probably modified with an upcoming reform on harmonization. So it's good to see that even though the GDPR remains sound, we have seen that there is a commitment to make the enforcement work despite the challenges at the moment, and that the EU institutions are making moves to try to fix some of the issue identified that is making the enforcement at the moment slower in our perspective, but also a little bit bureaucratic in the sense, it's what you were mentioning about transparency and the trust, and ultimately fundamental right might stay something very philosophical, if we don't make it a reality and something accessible for people. If people are waiting for 3 years for their access right or for the deletion right, we're going to lose. Also, there's the reality of how valuable it is for people. So there is a lot at stake here. On the experience part of the way we've also been working ourselves with enforcement, we're part of the EDRI network together with Bits of Freedom, and there is a lot of different ways NGOs within our network have worked on enforcement. Some have been very active on putting litigation, filing complaint cases, like it's a case for now, but Privacy International or Panopticon. On our side, we've always seen our role, and we are based in Brussels, so we are an advocacy organization towards the institution, and our role is a lot in the legislative side. But with the GDPR, we have also shifting with a dialogue with regulators, and we've taken several actions to what we call use the flagging system to flag issue early on to DPAs, and saying that there is an upcoming issue here, and you could act to prevent something from happening that will likely be a GDPR violation, and not necessarily have to wait for the violation to occur and to act. We've done so when TikTok was announcing that they were going to use legitimate interest as a legal basis for targeted ads, and the DPAs individually and collectively reacted in 10 days, which was really unprecedented for us to see, and just gave us, a bit of reassurance that things can work pretty quickly if this works this way. The Italian DPA started with the decision, and then others followed, and then we had a European-wide agreement that this was the way forward. And then we entered into also more specific dialogues from time to time on decision. We're saying, previously together we discussed the example of France in the cloud sector. I don't know if you want me to go into that.
I would love to get to that a little bit later. Yeah, that was a great example too. Thanks. Are there any questions at the moment? Any burning or not so burning questions? One here. I think they want you to walk to the microphone in the back, which seems counterintuitive, but it works for the people at home.
It's not working.
You walked all the way back there for nothing.
Yeah.
Maybe this works.
Yeah,
yes.
great.
I heard Sjoera talk about the buying power of the government and doing this for the government employees. Is this a possibility to also do this for the public, as the government is instated by the public and also tries to protect their rights?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Great question. As if we'd agreed in advance, because I can lob that ball over to the Data Protection Authority. I'm honestly a bit surprised that we've done this extensive work, well-documented forensic evidence, super large appendices with all of our technical findings for enterprise and education customers. And we know, basically, for average consumers, the situation is the same. So we had some hope, but and I must say, I fully understand how understaffed all the data protection authorities are. So no blame here, but a little disappointment that none of the DPAs picked up one of these reports and told the big techs, look, these findings are probably the same for consumers. Use the fact that Article 5.2 of the GDPR turns the burden of evidence around. Prove to me that you're not treating consumers this way or else. That I would have loved to have seen that approach.
And before we lob the ball over, or whatever, however you put it, I think actually your question was, can the government do this on behalf of the public? Yeah. So I would like to lob the ball over to Ron.
Yes, we looked into it because we would have loved to be able to do that. But the answer is shortly no.
Sorry.
I'll have to go in all the legal advice we got, but the answer of that was no.
Thanks, good question. We are going to go to the second example that we want to discuss today. And Cecile, that's one that you are hopefully still willing to introduce to us.
It's about the good examples, yes. We talked before about this session, and then we talked about good examples, and I was thinking about the last years, and I think in the Netherlands we really, and it's Ron who did it, I think also Ron personally did a lot of good work on all the corona applications in the Netherlands, which were really designed with privacy by design in mind and heart, I think. And there were many people who helped with that, from academics, from technical organizations. And I think we as a DPA were maybe quite critical during the development, and I think that was really necessary because we got a lot of questions from all kind of organizations who wanted to control the disease and wanted to control people by looking in all kind of personal data. So we really had to stick to our role and be very critical. But anyway, I think that the Corona app, which measured the vicinity of people who might be ill, was very well designed. And I think that was a very good example of how you really can develop a good service, good kind of part of software with privacy in mind. So it is possible, and I see Jaap Henk Hoepman also here in the audience, and read his book about privacy by design.
So I think what is interesting, you said we received a whole lot of questions. Of course, there are a lot of people wanting to use data and access to people's data to control the disease, control them. It must also not be easy in a crisis like this to stick to that role that you have and not kind of step outside it and see also where other people and are coming from and what the other interests are. Was that hard, or was it to you very clear from the start what it was that the DPA needed to do?
No, it was hard, and we really had huge discussions within our teams about what was at stake. Of course, I think, but at the same time, we were very worried about the use of data which would not be redressed after the crisis, and whether people went over some borders, for instance, at the use of mobile telephone traffic data, which we were very worried about. And but yes, we had a discussion, and this is what we always do. It's not only looking sort of literally to data protection, but we always have in mind what the use is and why data are being used, and that context is always important in our work. Yes.
Ron, maybe I can turn to you. So in the middle of the crisis, you were trying to get this app developed, and then the DPA issues a very critical report. Was that a welcome report?
Yes, it was. As it was the critics by Bits of Freedom, for example. Because, and it's all about trust. To get trust by the public, you need to be transparent, and you need to be able to look into the mirror and see what you're doing. And actually, to be honest, looking backward, first point is still about 20% of the public thought we were living in China and we were building Fallout. So we were not succeeding in getting trust from 100% of the population. Probably more than you would have got without being transparent, but still around 20% of people didn't trust what we're doing. And secondly, now being some sort of after the crisis, looking back, what we now find out is that contact tracing in itself didn't really fight the crisis as it did in the decades before, when people didn't travel as much. So contact tracing in itself worked for centuries. But now with people traveling far more than before, it didn't get as much, it didn't do as much in fighting the pandemic as we thought it would. So that contact tracing apps didn't do as much as we thought they would when building them. And
so you say the criticism is really important. It's also really important to gain the trust of the public. Do those two things contribute to each other, or is there also criticism that diminishes the trust of the public?
Well, I think the both are true. For a lot of people, being able to look into mirrors and to work with criticism actually enhances trust. But there's also a portion of society where people, because there is criticism, say where there is where there is smoke, there's fire, right?
And if you would pretend that I don't work for Bits of Freedom.
That's hard to do, but
Do you think that at times civil society was too critical, or was critical at moments where it wasn't very helpful?
no, one cannot be too critical. We need to be in discussion. We have to continue talking. That's for one. And what's needed is both civil society and academia in getting trust from society in what government's doing and what big tech is doing.
So I wanted to segue to Estelle for your reflection on kind of civil society's involvement in developments like these, and maybe in particular at moments of crisis. And I was also hoping that then you would bring up the example of the French Olympic Committee.
Sure, thank you. Maybe staying on the COVID app conversation, this was a really key moment also for civil society in addressing this balancing exercise, actually, that we don't really like to do, but this was a fundamental one to be doing, where, protecting your health and protecting your fundamental right, that this is an actual valid balancing to do, and how much interference into privacy was going to be allowed to make sure that everyone stayed safe. So fairly quickly, there was actually a big rallying moment where a lot of partners in academia and in research worked together with us as us in civil society in general, to put together a recommendation on how to do contact tracing in a privacy friendly manner, but in a way that the information would be useful for health professional, that it would be used for COVID and tracking, and for information that hospitals needed. It was also, I think, a big reality check of how outdated some of the data framework in hospitals were across Europe, and how actually, even though we were coming from a perspective of privacy advocate, we were the one saying that you can actually collect more, which was, I think, really odd for people to hear. But it also put back the reality of data protection is not and has never been about don't use data. It always is about use data responsibly and create a framework where people can do that. And so those use cases were really concrete and put us in front of those reality. There are members of our community like Michael Wild and Carmela Troncoso, who work super, super hard in helping develop the infrastructure behind a lot of the apps used in Europe. And I think for us, maybe one sticking point that we had to accept, even though that was an issue, is still the role that big tech played in those apps, because we had to entirely rely on Google and Apple privacy framework because our mobile phone depended on them. And so we were not happy, even though it illustrated, I think, quite clearly the power they hold over infrastructure. But we were also facing a situation of look, if we tell governments and if we tell everyone that you can't use this solution, then just the reality is that nothing will come up, and potentially harder. So we have to just make sure that we enforce the commitment that they put themselves on privacy really strongly. But hopefully that also helped having a larger conversation on competition. But it was a key moment, I think, to define that, to showcase also that you defend privacy, but you enter into those conversations bringing recommendation, but not as a no data ever being used.
And was that you've been with Access now almost 10 years, was that the first time that you really felt such a shift in civil society's role?
I think we've went through a lot of different really harsh crises over the past 10 years. I joined EDRI at the time when 1 month before the Snowden revelation happened, and few years after that, we lived through, in Belgium, in France, and across Europe, a series of really horrific terrorist attacks. And I think that also put us in front of those conversations of how much surveillance and intelligence gathering can be authorized and should be authorized to keep people safe. And there was a little bit of an overreach in the request of government at the time that would have put privacy at risk, but that was also a really defining moment within civil society in Europe to have the conversation also. This is not about those authorities not having any access to information because they're here to protect you. And having those conversations about health or about security, not everybody within the same community will necessarily share the same view of where the needle needs to be in those balancing, but they were really important to have and to show also that the important point is where are the safeguards and where are the control mechanism, and not, at least from our perspective, not come from a go away and have nothing, because it is also the reality we're in.
Okay. Before we go to the final example, questions from the audience. Yeah, one in the back. Frederik, who's at the mic, and you can join him, and then we'll take those two questions and continue. Yeah.
Sorry,
I think someone behind you is coming to help. But thank you for the offer.
Hi, Frederik Zuiderveen-Borgesius, Radboud University in the Netherlands. So there has always been this weird contradiction. Most of our human rights treaties were adopted after the Second World War in reaction on horrific human rights violations by governments. What do? We adopt treaties and we expect the state to protect us against the state. So I wonder, is this just another example of that weird contradiction that we have always had? Or is there something special about privacy which makes it different? And also, if it's whether we can learn anything in the privacy discussions on when we look back. For instance, it would be the government doing censorship, but now we expect also the government to arrange a public broadcaster, etc. Thank you.
God, what a complex question. We'll take the second one and then we'll answer them both, and you can start thinking of a good answer.
Hi, René Mailleux, Open University Netherlands and Dutch Data Protection Authority. I was wondering the role of the government. We had this example of the COVID tracing app where the government also took a very active role in developing the app itself. Is this something that the government can do more often? Because, of course, this was a crisis moment for a very particular kind of app, but why don't we have like a word processing thing that is either created by the government or through government funding with data protection and maybe other values in mind, or messaging apps or other thing that both the government uses, education uses, and every citizen uses?
Yeah, great question. Let's start with the last question. I think that might be slightly easier. Maybe, Ron, you want to answer it.
Well, I think that this two sides of the same coin. We need to be sure that services we use from companies adhere to GDPR and other laws. That's one. So that's needed. Secondly, part of our policy is to support pop-ups, for example. Yeah. So we are enabling external and internal developers and others to, for example, come up with policy implementations to support societal discussion. We are sometime in the coming weeks launching a Dutch government Mastodon instance, for example. So we are actively supporting the development of pop-ups.
Thanks. And then to Frederik's question, who would like to tackle that?
Difficult question.
Well, not that I have a real answer, but I was thinking whether is it different now from many years ago, and I think there is a difference in the sense that during and after the World War we were worried about government breaking human rights. And right now we see that it's not only government, but it's also companies, businesses, organizations, whatever you want to call them. And that is a sort of transition where we see that working globally, what is mentioned, we as DPAs within Europe have to work together strongly, which is quite difficult, but I think we make steps in that. And working globally is really new and even more challenging. And I think maybe that's a huge change.
Yeah. I think I completely agree with that analysis that one of the major changes is the involvement of the private sector in surveillance, which used to be government activity. And now we've also sort of outsourced the supervision tasks to the private sector, which I'm an example of, but all the DPOs that supervise the data processing within companies and organizations, the DPIA instrument, and the thing I think government is extremely good at, the Dutch government, and Ron doesn't take enough credit for, is providing models. So the Dutch government created a national government DPIA model to improve the quality of these type of audits. The Dutch government created an algorithmic impact assessment model, human rights impact assessments for algorithms, and is now working on a children's rights impact assessment model. And by funding academics and NGOs and all kinds of experts to help draft these models, the government enables a lot of other organizations to self-supervise in a way. So I think that is a really important contribution. And I haven't seen that many comparable initiatives from other governments, but maybe Estelle can speak to that.
Does Estelle want to speak to that?
I have not. No, indeed. It's and also this level of transparency you're preaching and acceptance of criticism is not something we see in a lot of openness in a lot of European government. Not to say that there is not, but I think there is still this reluctance on putting some of those conversations in the public eye. The fear of admitting mistakes being made, rather than showing that we've made a mistake, but we're fixing it. That could, I think, also improve the conversation.
Did you want to add something?
Yes, to your question, Frederick. I think society is now expecting government to protect them. And for example, where it's about children's rights and what's said about that in the DSA, and that brings us to a responsibility where we really, in a transparent and open way, show how we are trying to protect human rights and especially children's rights.
We're going to have to skip the other examples, but I'm sure the panelists are willing to tell you them in person after this panel, because we only have a little over 10 minutes left. We've been speaking about some of the sort of collaborative work that has led to great results over the past years. I'm also curious to hear about, especially when focusing on the interaction of that shared work, is there something that you would have done differently in the past years? Sjoera, could I start with you?
I don't know. No, I wouldn't have done a lot differently. No. I don't know. Sorry.
Okay, that's a valid answer. Estelle?
Sorry, I'm trying to explain without going into the example, but in some of the work we've been doing to bring compliance, speaking with government and regulators at the same time, because we placed ourselves at trying to do this flagging exercise and signaling that there would be potentially an issue if this and this is authorized. A lot of this work is both public but not really reported, because you don't report on a thing that almost happened. It's a bit redundant. But looking back, I do see a lot of value again in showing an aspect of enforcement of preventing a bad thing from happening. And being in civil society, you also know that a lot of our work is preventing bad thing from happening. And it's not about like, this could have been worse, and, and making a list of all the worst things that could have been. But I think sometimes it can actually help show the value of what is in front that deserve criticism and can always be improved. But if we don't start from the this and this was a red line, there is also then no learning of like, then let's not do it again, because it was already decided that this was one. And I think at least on the civil society side, we're not so good at communicating and sharing when we do those type of joint work all together to say that there was a discussion because it was identified as an issue and there was a decision that it cannot happen. So we can almost take it as jurisprudence and learning that this is not a good thing.
I think, at least from our experience, it's really difficult to get a journalist to write about something that didn't happen. Which civil society kind of relies on to get the message out about this stuff. Yeah, Ron?
Yes, what I've loved to have been doing is get more EU member states to join us. Like we are doing the 4th or 5th data protection impact assessment as a tiny government. And Sjoera talked about Microsoft. Microsoft changed their product worldwide. And now we're doing a DPIA on the MetaQuest VR. But we did human rights impact assessment for the first time to sort of front run the AI Act. But what if more than 20 member states each did one? We've not succeeded in getting there. So what I would love to do is for the coming years be able to do 20 DPIAs on large services to actually change them worldwide or at least in Europe. And we've not been able to get there yet.
Why is that, you think?
Well, actually, I think we're front running and we didn't get the rest to join us yet.
So it's a matter of time, you think?
I hope.
Yeah. Cecile?
Your question was, would we have done things differently? Well, I think that's difficult, but I agree that we are really not there yet, and we really have to, as DPA, being faster. I think that's very important, trying to be more effective, and we are trying to do that by really looking better at how to change systems, and not only having a fine here or a fine there. And I think these kind of working together with civil society, with organizations, with people from academics, but also with other supervisors on other areas like human rights or more sectoral, like the financial supervisors. I think that really can even help us and make our work stronger. So that's where we are going to work on next years. Yes.
And I guess that ties into the new role as algorithm watchdog that the DPA has.
Yes, that's, but not only for the algorithms and AI. I just heard Mireille Hildebrand talk about complex data processing systems or something like that instead of using AI and algorithms. And I think she's right, because it's not really, well, of course, AI and algorithms are important, and we have to look at that. But in general, it's about complex systems where we don't know what is happening with our personal data, and we have to work on that and look on the effects for human rights on that.
It sounds like an excellent bit of reframing. Are there any final questions from you people? Yes, here in the front. And I'm sorry, but we're going to have to make you walk to the back of the room. And feel free to join her. So that's 2 questions. I think we could do one more if anyone has one. Okay, then these are going to be the... yes, a 3rd question. Yeah. So please... try to frame your question as a question so that we can get to answer them all.
My name is Sjoera. I work as a policy advisor, and I'm the chair of the Green Left Party in Utrecht, the Netherlands. So when I look at the title, From Notorious Rule Breaker to Privacy Advocate, I don't know, it gives me a bit of mixed feelings, because when I look at the Dutch government and also the information position of the Dutch parliament, I think it's not something om naar huis over te schrijven, to say it in Dutch. I think it's something that we need to be really ashamed of. And also the track record, the huge track record of the Dutch government when it comes to algorithms that you just mentioned, Cecile, that is also racist and discriminatory. I don't know, when I look at the Dutch government, sometimes I think, okay, maybe you guys need a huge self-reflection session. So how do you reflect on that? And if I'm right, if I'm wrong, I would love to hear that.
Okay, thank you. So that's a request for self-reflection. Our next question, please.
Simon Ani, I'm the data protection officer at Uber. I have tried to listen very carefully, and if I summarize the success, it is money talks, because you have been able to get big tech either under threat of fines or under a promise of additional revenue. Now, if I put you, Ron, and Sjoera in charge of fixing the Dutch tax authority, what would then be the mechanism you would use to fix the GDPR compliance at the Dutch and fundamental rights compliance? So because money doesn't work there. So what would work there? I would love to hear that.
Yes.
Okay, so great. I'm sure we can answer that in under a minute. The final question, please.
You're sure you still want a 3rd question?
Well, you're there already, so come on.
Midas Nouwens, Aarhus University. I feel like a lot of the framing of the talk today has been kind of about national... Sorry, there we go. Yeah. A lot of the conversation today has been kind of around national sovereignty, right? Like to what extent can a country in different ways trying to make a change? I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on whether you feel the one-stop shop mechanism is really a constraint for you, or whether it's not been that relevant in these type of things.
Okay, great. So I'm going to divide these questions up, and I'm sorry if you disagree with how I do that. Ron, of course, I want to pass the question about self-reflection on to you. Estelle, I would like to see if you could comment a little bit on the future of the one-stop shop. And then, Sjoera, maybe you can take the question on how to fix the Dutch tax authority, and maybe also possibly, do you agree with the summary that the success boils down to money talks? Ron.
Yes. To answer the first one, as a civil servant, I sometimes am ashamed of where I work for. And people who don't know where you were talking about is the child benefit scandal. And that's a scandal that shouldn't have been there. Point. But the city of Rotterdam, for example, also used an algorithm they shouldn't have been using. And what they did, they handed over the algorithm and the data to journalists. They stopped using the algorithm. And actually, that's why transparency is needed. And that's why openness is needed. We all know that people make mistakes, but the way to treat them is to not punish being transparent and open, but to learn from that.
Great, thank you. Estelle.
Thank you. So, obviously, I'm not a DPA, so there is a limitation on how much I can say whether the one-stop shop is constraining national approach. But maybe putting it reversed, I think we need to remember that the GDPR is an EU-wide legislation that should be enforced and implemented the same way across the EU. That was the promise of the one-stop shop, which is definitely working for companies. We as Citizen are left with a three-stop shop. We speak to 3 different authorities, so there is a little bit of an issue there. But the national link was supposed to make sure that people would have, an easy access to a regulator who speak their language and can understand, and then keep a national component, not because of creating 27 different approach, but at least creating links with the 27 nationalities and 27 countries where people live. So I would not see it as an issue of it existing if it's to benefit people, but we're still trying to create a European system, and the sovereignty reference you make is dangerous from an EU perspective, in the sense where, if we revert back to nationalism when we're trying to hopefully still create an EU system, that's a problem. And sovereignty initially was a concept used by authoritarian regime in order to exercise control over population. So it's also sovereignty of who over whom. So I would hope that the one-stop shop is not used to dilute that, but that's not to say that obviously there is no issue with the one-stop shop in the way it's functioning, and it puts a lot of power in the hand of a few DPAs, which was not necessarily foreseen like that. But let's also not revert to a system where we would have 27 different ways of interpreting and protecting data protection, because we need to have the same rights across the continent.
So I can imagine you have a lot of feelings about the one-stop shop. Are there any that you're willing to share with this audience?
Well, I think some things are going well with the one-stop shop, and not everything. But what I think is important that for people, they can complain in their own country, and then it comes around at the right place. So I think that's very important. And we, as a Dutch Data Protection Authority, really hope that we can sort of come to harmonized regulation about how to proceed, how to have some procedures, because these different procedures in different countries, which come from local law systems, they are really in the way. And I have to say, we can find each other within Europe better and better during the year. So I think things are going better. But we try to urge for these more harmonized rules.
Thank you. Okay, Sjoera.
Here we go. I had some time to think, thanks. Fixing the tax authority and negotiating with Big Tech has one thing in common. They both lack awareness. And this is something I always work on very actively, also as an external data protection officer for some semi-Dutch government organization. It starts with a kind of making sure you're being heard when you talk about fundamental rights. And both across the ocean and at the Dutch tax authority, the awareness wasn't always there that this is a fundamental right that affects them as well. So, and then more specifically for the people that don't know, when the Dutch government makes mistakes, it has tectonic, seismic impact on people, and especially when the tax authority makes mistakes. To fix it is like the old proverb that says, raising a child requires a village. The reason why the Dutch tax authority made horrible mistakes is because of political democratic pressure to fight fraud, right? So there was this democratic pressure on the tax authority to devise all kinds of algorithms to detect fraud, to create more understanding amongst taxpayers by fighting crime, right? Abuse of this social benefits. So it requires an understanding from our entire democracy, not just civil servants, but also politicians and also NGOs for that matter, that you can't keep on changing the course of a cruiser every 6 months until rule by motion in the lower house and tell the tax authorities to entirely overhaul their policies and create new fraud detection algorithms. And the other thing is funding. The problem with it, I know a little bit about the tax authority. They work with like dinosaur type of database systems and software, and to repair that, to make sure they can actually reflect better the desires from democracy, they need new systems, they need a complete overhaul. And that's really hard because they're driving in a car that generates income for Dutch society, right? You can't fix the car while driving. This is the problem for the tax authority for the past 10 years. And I don't know, it requires a major effort, I think, from the politicians and parliament to take a decision to give them some peace and buy a new car and do it all over in the right way. So does it help, Simon?
All right, that's going to have to be good enough for now. Thank you all very much for sharing this hour with us and for your openness. Thank you all for listening, and we're out of time, so head towards your next panel, and thank you very much again.